Resume recording. All right, everyone, welcome to the either 15th or 16th Journal Club the Atlanta Area Evaluation Association has put on. Today, our presenter is Adam Lipus. He will be talking about his study, his article, I should say, Qualitative Nutrition Research in a Majority Indigenous, if I can say words right, a community, reflections on the role of a non-Indigenous researcher. So with that, I will let Adam take it over.
All right, thanks, Chris. Well, yeah, I'm excited by the opportunity to share a little bit about this article. And just a brief introduction. So as Chris said, my name is Adam Lipus, and I work here in Atlanta for Care USA. Although the article that I'll be talking about stemmed from work that I did as a Master of Public Health student at Emory University. I'll just jump right in here to talk a little bit about the context and the history behind this article. So back in 2014 and 2015, I had written my master's thesis based on work I did in Alto, Bolivia, with some Bolivian colleagues and some professors from Emory. And I had originally envisioned that project as something of a maternal and child nutrition needs assessment. But it really evolved into something more like a qualitative ethnographic study, something that was trying to understand nutrition from the perspectives of people, mostly indigenous people, who were adapting to a rapidly urbanizing and westernizing environment. Since finishing my thesis, a few years back, I've had a lot of time to reflect on that experience, and particularly on the ethical dilemmas and some of the power dynamics of being a researcher or evaluator in a community that is not my own, so to speak. So looking back, on one hand, I could look at myself back then as a lowly graduate student with good intentions, and I think that may be true, but it's also true that I happened to be a white American male who had the backing and even some financial support, some funding from a large research institution. So for reasons that are probably pretty obvious to many of you, those things put me in a position of power relative to the community and the local collaborators that I was working with. For example, it was me who really got to set the overall research agenda. So fast forward to around early 2019, and a couple of things happened that helped me bring some of my thoughts into more clarity. And that's what basically led to the publication of the article that I'll be sharing today. So I co-wrote this piece with my friend and colleague, Susanna. She's an indigenous Bolivian woman, and she was pretty instrumental in the original work during my master's program 5 or so years ago. So the article, if you read it, you'll see is written mostly from my perspective, and it talks about my own evolving view on my role, my motivations, my assumptions as a researcher or evaluator. I could kind of use those terms interchangeably, at least in this context. So the article is written, from that perspective on my role, particularly as somebody who is a white American male. And interspersed with my narrative about this process is narrative from Susanna, who is my Bolivian colleague. And the article basically culminates with 3 key personal lessons that I have pulled from this experience, and then 2 related pieces of advice that I wanted to share with current or aspiring researchers and evaluators. For today, since we don't have a ton of time, I figured I'd highlight one of those lessons and one of those pieces of advice, and then finish with one take-home message that I think underlies all of this. So one of the things that I pulled from my experience was to just be honest with myself and acknowledge my own self-interest as a researcher or an evaluator. Like many people, I think could probably relate, I went into this project as a master's student with the intention to benefit the community where I was working in some way. And I hope, in a number of ways that was the case. At the same time, I realized that I emerged from the project as probably the person who benefited the most, at least in the most tangible way. Just to put that into clarity, I mean, it was me who ended up with a master's thesis out of this. And then, a master's degree opened up a lot of professional opportunity for me as well as earning potential. So I think this type of self-interest is maybe unavoidable in our field, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. But my lesson that I've taken out of this was to just be more forthright with myself, to look at my work from the lens of who will truly benefit most tangibly and immediately from the work. And I think with that type of perspective, we can ask ourselves the tough questions a little earlier on and hopefully be able to develop more transparent and accountable partnerships with communities. Oh yeah, that represents my master's degree. Another thing that I'll pull out of the article is one key piece of advice, and that is that relationships matter. I know that's not an innovative concept per se, but let me talk about what I mean by that. I think you'll see in the article, we talk about, power dynamics. And I think when we think or talk about something like power dynamics, it can be all too easy to speak in pretty abstract terms and to see power imbalances as a problem of the system, so to speak. We think of that system as something that's big and nebulous and kind of too complex to fathom. But I think to me, the system is basically just people. It's you, it's me, it's our colleagues and various stakeholders and the way that we relate with each other. And I find that mindset of kind of breaking down the system into ourselves and our interpersonal relationships to be a lot more empowering in terms of our ability to recognize and potentially transform little power dynamics, little things here and there that can turn into something bigger. And just to explain that a little bit, what made me willing and able to write and share about an article like this was really the mutual respect and friendship that I developed with Susanna, with my colleague who you see there on the right. That we developed through our work, along with a friend of ours and a mentor, Chusa, who's in the middle. She has since passed away, but I think her example was pretty inspirational to me and to Susanna about how you navigate some of these issues of, in our case, me being a Westerner coming in, more of an outsider, Susanna being the local partner, so to speak, somebody who is quite a bit closer to the situation that we were researching. And, even this morning, as a case in point of how important relationships are when we're dealing with challenges such as, power dynamics and historical injustice, I got a message from Susanna this morning on WhatsApp. To be honest, last night and this morning, I was feeling a little anxious about sharing today, and she sent me a message that was really encouraging and inspirational. And those types of things, I think, help me and help others to, put us in a mindset to share our own personal reflections and start to make little baby steps towards hopefully transforming larger power structures. And then I'll just pull out, I think, one key, take-home message that I think underlies a lot of the individual lessons learned and pieces of advice that I share in the article. And that take-home message is this. So I don't know, that may not be what you expected to see. I'm curious, I'm not quite sure how many people are on the line, but I'm curious if anybody knows this reference and could explain what we see up here. So feel free to unmute yourself or pop something into the chat box.
Well, I'll throw it out there. It's Smokey the Bear. He's, I think he came from the National Parks Department, but I could be wrong, on fire prevention campaigns. Yes, Jory Hall says, I know this reference, yes.
Okay.
Smokey the Bear, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, Smokey Bear, who is a mascot for the U.S. Forest Service. And so my dad actually worked his entire career for the Forest Service. And funny enough, this image popped into my head as I was preparing this session yesterday. So for decades, I'll explain the reference a little bit. The Forest Service has had this campaign of only you can prevent wildfires. And it's been a campaign that's been pretty successful to get people to be diligent about putting out their own campfires, trying to be good stewards of the land and prevent wildfires. And to me, I think one of the things that's really powerful about this message is, when you think about it, no, of course, it's not true that only one person could be in charge of preventing any and all wildfires, right? It's, not you, not me, not anybody else. Yet if none of us sees it as a personal responsibility to prevent wildfires, then we're going to have human caused wildfires that continue to rage. So for me, it's an interesting metaphor because I think it's that type of mindset that's really important when we talk about things like ethical dilemmas and power disparities in the context of research and evaluation. Um, I think having a mindset of personal responsibility and opportunity is really critical when we're dealing with things that are rooted in really centuries of history. Um, it's more empowering to see yourself as, an integral actor in that system and somebody who could potentially, transform some of these power dynamics. So I will leave it here with a quote that actually concludes the article itself. I'll give you just a moment to read through it. And then I had a couple of discussion questions, one a little more open-ended and one a little more targeted. So I'll just put this quote up from my colleague, Susanna, and then we'll move on to some discussion questions. So I think that, encapsulate, she and I were each trying to share our individual and collective story with the hopes that it could, resonate with other people who have dealt with similar challenges and opportunities in your own work. And so with that, I know we have a few minutes for discussion here. So, my first question is really an invitation. I'm curious to hear from anybody on the call. Um, for those of you particularly who have read the article, did you see any parallels with some of your own work, specifically in research and evaluation?
I'll start it off, and then I'll let other people chime in. It just really reminded me of my, not how you approached it, but rather the things I wish I would have known when I started doing evaluations in cultures and contexts I wasn't familiar with. It's a good reminder of implicit, if that's right. No, I'd say more like a subconscious hubris or ignorance of the way the world works that I wish I would have had your takeaways back when I was working in groups, and that I would not have to have learned them the hard way. So yeah, that's the parallel I saw, and that you did address these things, but some of us learn the hard way, and we have to learn it a few times. So.
Yeah, and I think I like that concept too of learning it a few times. One of the other things I tried to touch upon in the article is it really is a continuous journey of reflection. And I think certainly we're not always going to get it right. So I think having that recognition that you won't always get it right and that you do need to look back and reflect is, I think, a huge part of it for me.
Hi, this is Saman. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, yeah. So as you're talking and I, skimmed through the article that you shared, this idea, not in terms of research, but really kind of touches on my experience in Peace Corps. Community involvement and being the change agent and all those sorts of things, which I think these same sorts of lessons kind of come up when it comes to the power dynamics and how communities see, one as an outsider, people as Americans as having money, and just kind of that shift. And one of the takeaways that I had from that experience was that over time you can really start to hand over that power to people once they kind of develop that basic trust. So I completely agree with you. That's a very important factor in any work.
Thanks so much. And if you don't mind a follow-up question, was there a moment where you felt like you were able to, recognize the power that you had, in a moment where you felt like, okay, this is something that I want somebody else to have more agency in this process?
At a certain point, I decided that I wasn't going to do any funded projects. And early on, like Peace Corps said, well, and other volunteers who had been there for 2 years and were leaving kind of gave that advice, like, don't bring money in at the very beginning, see what it is, learn about your community, and then kind of listen to them to see what their needs are and what they would like to learn. And in the community that I was in, I just decided that I wasn't going to bring money into it. And my focus just became more on education. And then as I was working in a health center, as I educated the mothers, they started educating each other, and I didn't have to do that anymore. So that's just an example of them kind of taking it over and owning it.
Great, thanks for sharing. Chris, I think we're scheduled to go until just 12:20, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And I wanted to make sure I left you some time. There's a couple slides there just about AAEA in general.
Please go on. Those are just filler slides, but okay.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Well, yeah, then I guess in that case, we have a couple of minutes if anybody else wants to chime in.
I'll just throw out there, I liked the way the information was presented, the format of the article, and I'm trying to think of other examples, and I don't see it often, of where there's these demarcated spaces where you're giving people room to give a different perspective than the voice of the majority of the article. When you brought Susanna in, and she essentially had those sections where she talked about either her perspective on something, her experience. It just made the story of the article really pop out. So I just wanted to say that was a good call.
Thank you. Yeah, it was definitely a very intentional choice, and kind of resulted from some of the reflections I had about the work itself. Talking about this aspect of interculturality and this idea of people bringing their different perspectives and harmonizing those, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you end up with one voice. And so I felt like the most authentic way to tell the story would be to say, okay, here is my voice and here is Susanna's, rather than trying to merge those into something that was just one co-written article throughout.
I think it worked well. So unless anybody has, feel free to keep on talking throughout comments. But if you have to leave at this time, I understand that 12:20 is here. So if you are hopping off, and if this is the end, thank you everybody for joining us, and Adam for both writing the article and presenting on it. I'm really grateful.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Yay.
I have to hop off.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Right. next time.